On this edition of Sightings, a disturbing two-part report on enormous flying triangles that have recently been witnessed by thousands of people on the ground and in the air.
The co-pilot instinctively ducked because it was so close.
Then, Nick Pope from the British Ministry of Defense speaks out about the very real danger these UFOs represent to his government.
I certainly believe that some of them are extraterrestrial spacecraft.
New owners are renovating Arizona's historic Jerome Hotel, but some of its past just won't go away.
I couldn't prove that they are hauntings, and I couldn't prove that they're not.
Even if you've heard about biofeedback, its new uses will startle you. And is it an ancient curse that continues to plague the construction of Hawaii's newest highway?
It will never be right for a freeway to be on top of those sacred places. Never.
Welcome to Sightings. I'm Tim White. Airline pilots see UFOs. They just don't talk about it. And their culture of silence explains a lot about why one series of reoccurring visits from enormous triangular craft has so far gone unreported. The UFOs, called silent Vulcans, are said to have made hundreds of appearances in the skies above Great Britain. But this is the first time the phenomenon is being discussed outside of England by professional pilots and others who have seen them.
Look at that! Bloody hell!
For the past 3 years, this is what hundreds of eyewitnesses have been watching and videotaping in the skies over England. These tapes are misleading because the UFOs are enormous, larger than any aircraft now flying. They are triangular in shape with large glowing lights at each corner. They can soar slowly, hover, or accelerate to a tremendous speed. But one of the most eerie aspects of these UFOs is what they don't do.
For sure, in all cases, people report that these things made no noise whatsoever. Some have been seen only a few hundred feet up.
From the left, this enormous craft came over the houses.
And I couldn't believe my eyes, because there was no sound at all from this object.
It banked over sharp to the left, and then I could see it was a huge triangle.
Investigators have dubbed them silent Vulcans for their passing resemblance to the British Delta Wing bomber known as the Avro Vulcan B-2. But that, according to UFO magazine editor Graham Birdsall, is where the similarity ends.
The Vulcan was a pretty much triangular-shaped aircraft, unique for its time. But certainly it was no bigger than, let's say, for instance, 60 feet across, and nothing like the kind of size that we associate with today's flying triangles, as it were.
Because they are so much larger than Vulcan B-2s, some aircraft experts are suggesting that the UFOs may be part of a super-secret American stealth project.
I just cannot believe that something as big as that, flying over the United States fairly low, flying over here in the United Kingdom fairly low, and flying in such numbers, could be described as a conventional super-secret stealth aircraft. I just don't buy the argument.
Neither, apparently, does Britain's Civil Aviation Authority, which recently investigated a near miss between a silent Vulcan and a British Airways 737 on approach to Manchester Airport. Commercial pilot Graham Shepherd, whose own airborne encounter has fueled a 20-year interest in UFOs, has studied the Manchester near miss.
Quite suddenly, what the crew described as a triangular, very brightly lit craft flew past them very, very close on their right-hand side. And the reports mentioned that the co-pilot instinctively ducked because it was so close. Now, they were clearly shaken up by this. They asked radar if they had any traffic, and radar didn't see anything.
The Civil Aviation Authority pursued their investigation of the case for more than a year and released their report in February of 1996. Their conclusion, however, was no conclusion at all. Only that the UFO was unknown. Case closed. When Graham Shepherd attempted to follow up with the British Airways crew, he hit a brick wall.
I've written to the captain and he hasn't replied, and I have heard on the grapevine that he's not going to discuss it any further with anybody else. He's fed up with the whole thing, and that if the same thing ever happened to him again, he wouldn't report it. So that this comes back to the culture of silence, the consensus of the line of least resistance is to say nothing about these things.
It's left to researchers like aeronautical engineer Omar Fowler to pursue an explanation for the silent Vulcans.
The flap in Derby started about 1994. From December 1994 until May 1995, we had 52 incidents of flying triangles over the city, hovering over main streets, buildings, highways, cars, and this caused quite a lot of consternation to the local public.
Although their appearance over England is relatively recent, similarly shaped UFOs have been reported throughout the world, going back more than 20 years.
In the Hudson Valley area of New York, literally hundreds of these things were reported by some pretty sane, level-headed people.
We looked over the top of the trees, and there was this object there out of nowhere, this great big object. It was about 300 foot wide, the size of a football field hanging over your head.
They first attracted worldwide attention when in 1988 and 89 and 90, there were several thousand sightings, some of them at low level, of triangular-shaped objects over Belgium.
Timothy Good, author of Beyond Top Secret, believes that Belgium was the turning point for the phenomenon because of the credibility of the eyewitnesses.
Not just ordinary civilians, but highly qualified observers, such as military pilots.
The Belgian Air Force was very open and disclosed how many missions they'd flown against flying triangles, and they even went to the extent of releasing cockpit radar film showing an F-16 intercepting that triangle and the terrific acceleration of the triangle away from the stationary position. In many cases, they accelerated from 0 to, say, 900 kilometers an hour within a matter of seconds. They dropped from 10,000 feet to 500 feet in a few seconds. They were performing aerobatics that no human pilot could have withstood the G-forces.
I think there could well be something ominous about this. When I think back to 1988, when on 2 occasions United States Navy Tomcat aircraft were seen to disappear in close proximity to one of these gigantic triangular-shaped craft. And I spoke to the witnesses in both instances, and I'm convinced they were telling the truth.
Off the record, pilots, both military and civilian, are concerned. The silent Vulcans seem to want to engage our aircraft, and even the most highly trained pilots have never been trained how to deal with the security threat of an extraterrestrial kind.
As far as a threat is concerned, my feeling is, yes, some of these craft are dangerous. I have no doubts about that whatsoever. And some of the beings associated with them are dangerous. I don't think they have our best interests at heart.
The silent Vulcan phenomenon has changed the thinking of many former skeptics, including one member of Britain's Ministry of Defense. When we return, my interview with Nick Pope, a man who has studied UFOs from the inside and is now speaking out.
Next, Nick Pope speaks his mind.
I cannot stay silent about what I believe we must treat as a potential threat.
Huge motherships, known as silent Vulcans, have been spotted in the skies above Great Britain for more than 10 years. But even after dozens of confirmed sightings by professional pilots and other credible eyewitnesses, no one in the British government has made public comment on the phenomenon. Until now. Joining the Sightings investigative team in London, I met Nick Pope, the #1 UFO man in the Ministry of Defense. For 40 years, Defense Ministry policy regarding UFOs was to deny, deflect, or dismiss all sightings. This 1952 document to then Prime Minister Winston Churchill reveals that UFOs were routinely explained away as everything from lunar eclipses and lousy weather to stray birds and optical illusions.
Not until 1991 did things change, when a diligent government worker named Nick Pope put his career on the line by exposing what he believes to be an alarming threat from outer space.
I cannot stay silent about what I believe we must treat as a potential threat.
When Pope first accepted his assignment to process UFO reports at the Defense Ministry, he was as skeptical about alien spacecraft as the long line of civil servants who had preceded him. But then he started reading the reports.
It seemed strange to me that none of my predecessors had really seemed to take this very seriously. My brief at the Ministry of Defence was to look for evidence of a threat to the defence of the UK. I felt that I couldn't make a decision about whether there was or was not a threat until I'd done a full investigation.
For Pope, that meant personally interviewing eyewitnesses and established UFO researchers.
For a Ministry of Defence officer to start talking with UFO researchers was unheard of, and it was very much frowned upon in his office. I remember he told me at the time that, you know, it was rather like sleeping with the enemy.
As UFO reports by the hundreds crossed Pope's desk, he began to believe that the phenomenon had serious national and global implications.
Was there a point in time at which you became someone who said, you know, there's really something here?
Yes, I think 31st of March 1993, when I got into work, and during that day, I suppose, took several dozen calls from people, a lot of police and a lot of military witnesses, saying that they had seen a structured craft. I had reports, for example, from a meteorological officer, a chap with 8 years of experience of looking at the night sky and judging what the weather was going to be so that he could brief the air crew. As he put it to me, it behaved like nothing he had ever seen before in his entire life. He did not have the slightest idea what it was, and it passed straight over the top of the base.
This was not the last time Pope would hear about the silent Vulcans. The reports were particularly disturbing because these UFOs seemed to be targeting military bases and were impossible to trace.
The disturbing thing was that these didn't show up on radar at all, so we never got our air defense aircraft off the ground. That worries me, that you know, something which you've got to regard as potentially hostile until you know what it is, what it's doing, can get slap bang over the top of a military installation without showing up on the radar, without us getting any air defense assets even deployed.
You determined that there might well be threats to national security, and yet nobody listened, right? Your superiors weren't interested in what you had to say?
People don't like admitting that they've been wrong, and it's much easier for them to just say, no, maybe Nick Pope was wrong, maybe he's misinterpreting the data. I just can't support that view. I was the one getting the raw data. I was doing the investigation.
Did anyone ever come along and tell you to calm down a little bit and cool it?
Yes, on one or two occasions, people said to me, you know, I think you're devoting a little bit too much time and effort into this.
The official angle, of course, has always been very much the typical stiff British upper lip. It's all foolish nonsense, there's nothing to it, and that's all I'm going to tell you.
UFO Magazine has done a series of articles on Nick Pope. It believes the British government is hiding UFO secrets which dwarf Pope's revelations.
The Cold War may be over, but here in Great Britain, we still shiver sometimes because of the secrecy.
Some others would suggest that Nick Pope basically was just the front man for a grand cover-up.
Well, I don't think there is any great cover-up in Britain. I think that what we actually have is a position where people, far from knowing too much about the phenomenon and then keeping it all under wraps, know corporately far too little about it. The best way to study the real UFOs, as I like to call them, was to very quickly eliminate the ones that were just misidentifications. 9 out of 10 of them did have conventional explanations.
What do you think people are seeing in that 10% of the cases where there are not prosaic answers for UFOs?
I certainly believe that some of them are extraterrestrial spacecraft, that quite simply elsewhere in the universe other intelligences have evolved and are doing what, after all, we ourselves are now beginning to do, to go out into space and to see what's out there.
Unlike his counterparts in the United States, Nick Pope has not felt constrained to keep out of the UFO limelight. At lectures and on television, Pope has continued to bring his message and his warning to the British people.
What I'm trying to do is to give a flavour of what has been an extraordinarily uneasy and difficult relationship between the world of officialdom in the UK and this incredibly elusive, mysterious UFO subject.
In his book about his experiences at the British Ministry of Defense, Pope concludes, "We all like to think we're in control, but what happens when we're not? What happens when we refuse to accept that a threat even exists, let alone do anything to counter it? This is the ultimate dilemma about UFOs, which we must face. We can't begin to find any solution until we first acknowledge that there is a problem."
Even though Nick Pope does not believe that there is a conspiracy of silence within the British government, it is interesting to note that after his recent revelations about UFOs, Pope was moved to a new position. He is now an economic analyst at the Ministry of Defense.
Next, has this computer scientist succeeded in creating artificial life? Later, Sightings investigates a very historic and a very haunted Arizona hotel.
Here are some of the stories Sightings is following in the news. Saucers land in Manhattan, well, in New York City art galleries, that is. Artwork with an alien motif is making a big splash this season, and investors are setting up and taking notice.
In New York City, a Soho gallery showing can mean the difference between instant fame and lifelong obscurity for an artist. This is where the trends are set, and this is where a new genre is emerging. It's being called UFO art.
There's a broader interest that has made UFOs almost like a cultural icon. It's pervading our society.
Display spaces like the American Primitive Gallery and the Hudson Grill are promoting these icons of pop culture as fine art, giving them a new legitimacy in the mainstream.
There's art in this show that are made by artists who are trained artists who are interested in the subject or have some kind of a fascination with it. And then there are people who are making the art to actually express this experience they actually had.
It's almost therapeutic. An alien abduction or a contact with a UFO is a life-shattering experience. It's something one never forgets. There's a need to be able to deal with it through artwork. It's a channel.
And what gallery owners are discovering is that it is not only the UFO community that is embracing UFO art.
The people who have been coming to see this show are, again, as wide a spectrum as the people who made the art.
I didn't anticipate being contacted from all over the country as far as people interested in finding out about the show and wanting to get pictures.
The artists are just as surprised to find such a broad market for their work.
I think there's a lot more people out there that have been making art of this type and probably artwork that I can't even imagine. It feels like the show is just a tip of an iceberg.
The next UFO art show in Manhattan is set to open on Independence Day 1997 to coincide with the landing of the Pathfinder probe on Mars. In Murray Hill, New Jersey, a research physicist at Bell Labs has created a computer simulation that he believes mimics the spontaneous creation of life on an infant planet Earth.
One of the things that hadn't been done before that I wanted to look at was to see if I could spontaneously generate self-replicating programs from what was an initially random soup of instructions.
Dr. Pargelis discovered that when he typed a random series of commands into his computer program, the program soon began to take on a life of its own.
And once that happens, I now have a self-replicating host that then begins to generate children. And that is what we think occurred on Earth billions of years ago and is occurring to this day.
Until recently, the term alive was only applicable to animals and plants. But Dr. Pargelis' amoeba program raises provocative questions about what is a life form.
Modern dictionaries now say that life is a material complex that, among other things, can metabolize, can reproduce, can adapt to a changing environment, etc. There's been some interesting questions with regards to life and whether these things are alive. All I can say is if we do consider them to be alive, it's extremely primitive.
Primitive or not, the creatures in this program are apparently on the evolutionary fast track.
It may take a day, let's say, for some really interesting organisms to develop in my program. Still, it's a lot quicker than what we think is the time span here on Earth of several billion years.
This computer colony can't jump off the screen, but could it infiltrate other computers at Bell Labs or beyond?
What we have is a virtual world where we've got little programs that are in memory, and they're not in any way trying to access the operating system. So these are not at all like viruses that some evil hacker might use.
Dr. Pargelis hopes that this high-tech experiment will lead to computer programs that can update and optimize themselves, just as life on Earth has adapted to eons of change.
There's a great deal that still needs to be done. I mean, we've really only just scratched the surface.
From Roswell, New Mexico, an update on our report about a mysterious piece of debris allegedly retrieved from a flying saucer crash site. The fragment was given to Max Littell, administrator of the International UFO Museum and Research Center. An anonymous party turned the medal over to Littell and claimed that the fragment was found in 1947 among the crash wreckage. Initial tests by a metallurgist at New Mexico Tech determined that the sample was composed of layers of copper and silver, both elements known to be present on other planets. Well, now an independent analyst has performed further testing and has come to his own conclusion that the alleged crash debris is of terrestrial origin, perhaps a piece of unusual jewelry. Although the results of the tests are only preliminary, Littell has accepted them and plans no further analysis. But he and other researchers continue to search for legitimate, hard evidence that will finally put Roswell to rest.
We'll have more stories in the news next time. Now, here's what's coming up as Sightings continues.
The Jerome Hotel's haunted past comes back to life.
There are things that have happened in this building that I can't explain.
Later, more problems for Hawaii's cursed highway.
Jerome, Arizona was like a lot of prosperous towns in the Old West. Jerome thrived as long as the mine nearby thrived. But when the mine closed down, Jerome became a ghost town. But now, lured by untouched historic buildings and its prime tourist location, people are moving back to Jerome. The only problem is the ghosts aren't moving out.
Jerome is in the middle of nowhere. But in the 1920s, this was a boom town, home to one of the most lucrative copper mines in the world. Legend has it that everyone who was anyone visited Jerome. Residents here enjoyed every modern convenience, including the best-equipped hospital in Arizona. Then, in 1953, the mines closed, the money dried up, and Jerome's population plummeted from 15,000 to just a handful of holdouts. The buildings were abandoned, the doors of the hospital were closed, and the owners simply walked away.
It's gone through many, many years of being vacant and somehow remained intact. I don't know what basically protected it.
In 1994, Larry Altier and his brother Bob purchased the old hospital from the Phelps Dodge Mining Company. They renovated it and reopened it as the Jerome Grand Hotel. It wasn't long before guests and workers alike began experiencing strange, haunting activity.
There are things that have happened in this building, then things that I have seen in this building that I can't explain.
The main feeling that I get is energy being pulled out of me.
There's enough bizarre things that have happened that I couldn't prove that they are hauntings, and I couldn't prove that they're not. Primarily, we hear strange noises. It could sound like a door opening or closing.
We had one person on the third floor. Nobody came in the building, and he says that there was somebody knocking on his door and attempted to open it. And now I can rely on myself because I am the one here. There was no other way to get up there.
Sightings mounted an investigation led by noted psychic Jorianne DeVry. After spending just one night in the hotel, DeVry said she knew why there was so much paranormal activity inside this long-abandoned landmark.
As I stop here, this is dense to me. This is heavy, this is thick. I've got goosebumps going up and down my whole body.
Accompanied by the Altier brothers and several Jerome residents who had had experiences in the building, DeVry conducted a kind of psychic tour, trying to put a name to the dark, dense energy she felt swirling inside and outside the recently restored hotel.
Hey, has anyone ever felt like somebody, like psychically coughing on them, or?
What was my mother-in-law was staying in the room next door here, and she swears up and down that somebody was walking up and down the hallway up in this area coughing. They had had a number of plagues hit the valley. Here with a lot of your underground mining and stuff, some people were more susceptible to lung problems.
While it wouldn't be unusual to feel illness and suffering inside a former hospital, Jorianne was adamant that what she was sensing were not the spirits of patients. She felt these were victims.
I picked up a shooting and a hanging.
You did?
Yes, I did.
I'm telling you, you're scary. The shooting that you're referring to was an attempt. It wasn't successful, and that happened in the room we just walked through.
The superintendent was successful in his shooting.
Now, here's one I don't know about.
Okay, good. Then we did have a successful shooting,
yes.
Right? Oh, can I add one more thing?
Yes.
Did somebody fall to their death?
This is what I've heard. I cannot document it. I've heard that a guy was injured and he was in a wheelchair.
Okay.
And he pulled himself out here and he got himself over it.
And although DeVry had never visited the hotel or read about its history, she walked directly into this room and revealed a tragic secret.
I picked up somebody hanging themselves very clearly in this environment.
Goosebumps.
Choked with emotion, former police chief Ron Balator revealed that in 1983, in this very room, he had discovered a body hanging from this pipe.
Was there anyone that was involved in a relationship situation at all that kind of drove them,
Yes.
Beyond the point and stuff? Because I'm telling you, something heavy was going on. It was a romantic situation. I know it was.
The gentleman that lived here was separated from his wife.
Okay.
By some circumstances that he had no control over at all.
Right.
As a matter of fact, my understanding is that some relatives really had control of his life. And he did not want to be separated from his wife, nor did she want to be separated from him. But he ended up living here while she was living in Clarkdale. And I guess at some point it just got to be too much for him.
Throughout her tour, DeVry kept coming back to this elevator where she felt very negative energy.
When I was coming into the elevator, I sensed that there was like a heaviness in the air. It felt like it was thicker, more dense.
And it was in the boiler room, where the elevator's motor and controls are located, that DeVry began to put together more pieces in this hotel's psychic puzzle.
This seems to be significant. It felt like activity around this area. Did the elevators ever get stuck or anything like that also?
In 1935, they were having a problem with it.
See, and even right now, sitting here, I'm getting a little pain in my head. I don't know if a person got caught up back here or got stuck or having problems back here. Does that make sense? Okay, did they expire?
Yes.
They did expire.
In 1935, maintenance engineer Claude Harvey was found here, his head crushed under this very same elevator. A coroner's inquest ruled the death an accident, even though no autopsy was performed, and the elevator was in perfect working order. Historian Nancy Smith believes the inquest raises more questions than it answers, and that Harvey may have died at the hands of another.
There were a lot of questions that weren't asked. I think they were in a hurry to get as much of the minimum facts in as they could so that they could come to that verdict that it was an accidental death and that the company had no responsibility in it. I think it's a good whodunit.
Jorianne DeVry agrees. Claude Harvey's death was no accident, and the horrible injustice that took his life has also trapped his spirit inside the Jerome Grand.
And I believe that he is unsettled. I believe that there's some restlessness around him and his questionable death.
DeVry believes that Claude Harvey's restless spirit has created a negative psychic vortex at the Jerome Grand. But she suggests, once the true cause of Harvey's death is finally uncovered, he and all of the guests at the hotel will finally be able to rest in peace.
Jorian's psychic hits were all the more impressive because she was given no information whatever about Jerome or the Grand Hotel before her arrival. In fact, Jorian lives in Indiana, and she'd never even been to Arizona before her work on this story.
Next.
She really couldn't pay attention very well. Neurologically, she was out of control.
How biofeedback has helped people to actually reprogram their brains.
Brain disorders, like clinical depression and ADD, attention deficit disorder, are most often treated with drugs that attempt to alter the chemistry of the brain. However, more and more doctors and psychologists are exploring a new kind of non-chemical treatment called EEG biofeedback. It's a new treatment based on the theory that the brain can be trained to fix itself.
You are hearing the sound of brain waves at work. Hooked up to computers via these sensors, children with attention deficit disorder are learning how to reprogram their brains. ADD sufferers are highly distracted, often hyperactive, and out-of-control kids who have long been treated with drug therapy. But at the Drake Institute for Behavioral Medicine, Dr. David Velkoff offers his patients an alternative, using a kind of hands-off Nintendo.
They're playing a video game that their brain controls, and when they're producing normal brain waves, the video game works. They're hooked up to an electrode that records their brain waves, and when their brain shifts to a faster speed that's necessary for focusing, concentrating, being calm, they see fast brain waves on a computer screen through video games.
8-year-old Portia Gardner had been living with her aunt and uncle, Joan and Rex Campbell, for 4.5 years before she was finally diagnosed with severe ADD.
From the time that she was with us, I kept saying, you know, something's not right here. I didn't know what was wrong. She couldn't remember simple directions. She was very destructive.
Sometimes I felt so bad that I locked myself in my room for like a whole day.
Life at home with Portia was extremely difficult, and keeping her in school was nearly impossible.
We got many letters from school stating that Portia, she disrupted the class all day, she wouldn't behave, she wouldn't stop talking.
The teacher said that she was not focusing in school, she was drifting away.
Instead of more traditional drug therapy, the Campbells decided to try behavioral therapy before resorting to Ritalin.
Portia, when she first came here, was extremely hyperactive, impulsive, significant difficulty sitting still, and because of that, she really couldn't pay attention very well. Neurologically, she was out of control.
So why don't you show me your focusing position, okay?
Portia came to Drake 3 times a week, every week, for 5 months. Altogether, she received 45 half-hour treatments.
Really relaxing your body, your back. Doing great.
To use an analogy, Portia's brain, like many others with ADD, was stuck in a different gear than it should be. By observing her own brain waves, then focusing and concentrating on changing gears, Portia was able to retrain her own mind.
The feedback is helping me a lot. Like, I'm not moving as much as I used to in class, and I'm focusing a little bit better than I used to.
Now I want Portia to come up, and I want her to solve this problem, sister. Solve that problem.
Through her own determination and the power of her mind, Portia is turning her life around.
Excellent, excellent.
Portia's life has changed dramatically. Her self-esteem has changed, her self-confidence has changed, her view of herself has changed.
Shimmy, shimmy, cocoa pop. Shimmy,
She's
shimmy,
always singing and skipping and playing, and she loves to come in and repeat rhymes and stuff she's learned in school.
I look in the mirror and what do I see? A funny-looking monkey looking back at me.
She's a much happier child now.
It was ugly before. It was bad. It wasn't going great for me. It wasn't going good for me.
Breakthroughs with EEG biofeedback are not exclusive to children with ADD. Great strides are also being made with adults who are trying to break the chain of physical addiction.
You know, I guess when I look back over my life, I realized that I had a problem with alcohol fairly early on in life. I had my first DUI when I was 19 years old. And so I guess that's an indication that there may have been a problem.
Norm Lomax is proud to be clean and sober and credits the Life Sciences Institute in Topeka, Kansas with his recovery. His success with EEG biofeedback came at the end of a long and tortuous road. He'd been to 3 different residential treatment centers. He tried numerous outpatient therapies and support groups, and he nearly lost his wife of 27 years.
Before Norm went to Life Sciences, living with him was like living with nothing. He would come home from work, he'd go to the basement, he'd drink, he'd go to sleep. It's like he wasn't even there.
In what he was sure was to be his last hope, Norm began to try to retrain his brain. He worked with Carol Snar, a psychophysiologic therapist and one of the pioneers in using EEG biofeedback to treat physical addictions, particularly alcoholism.
Alcoholics are people often that have a deficiency in one of those slower brainwaves, the brainwave that's called alpha. It's a very important brainwave in that when we produce some of that, that is the brainwave that gives us a sense of joy, a sense of ease in life. So what we are attempting to do is increase the amount of the alpha brainwave that they produce and thus help them feel a lot more at ease in life. An individual will sit and listen to the machine. There's a tone for each one of the brainwaves that we produce. So their task is to get a sense of getting into the state of consciousness that will produce more of those tones.
Within just a short while, I learned to recognize the difference in the different brainwave patterns, and I knew when the things that we wanted to increase or improve were happening.
Results vary widely, but Norm believes he had a significant breakthrough after just 5 sessions.
By about 11 o'clock in the morning, I was starting to have kind of a really crummy day. I had to go down the street to a hardware store to pick up some parts. And on the way back to the shop, I drove by the same liquor store that I'd gone to hundreds of times. And the thought crossed my mind, you know, I can lick this problem real quick. All I got to do is just stop in here. But for some reason, I didn't even slow down, and I didn't stop. And I just went on with the rest of my day. That was the day that I realized the difference between concentrating my efforts to not do all those bad things and instead just relax and do the right things.
That was 2.5 years ago. Since then, success, not failure, is the story of Norm's life. Success he attributes to changing not only his behavior patterns, but also his brainwave patterns.
I really don't feel like that I'm a recovering alcoholic. I mean, I think I have recovered. After I completed the other treatment programs, I went out living my life a day at a time, just hanging on and trying not to drink. Today, that's not even one of the considerations.
The odds appear to be in his favor, too. The Life Sciences Institute claims a success rate of between 65 and 70%, and they claim it's success that lasts forever.
That's one nice thing about it is with biofeedback of any kind and as well with the brainwave training that once you have made the physiological changes in the body that they stay.
It's sobered him up and it's kept him that way and really gave him back to us, out of the bottle, back to us.
The mysterious power of the mind remains largely undiscovered, and the success people like Portia and Norm are enjoying is only the beginning of a new science on the cutting edge.
To say that this experience with the biofeedback and the brainwave training has changed my life significantly would be an understatement.
I'm glad that I got help. It's much better for me.
EEG biofeedback is still quite controversial. But more and more people are turning to this non-invasive therapy for help with everything from panic attacks to sleep disorders to epilepsy. And an ongoing VA study is showing that EEG biofeedback may even be effective in relieving veterans' PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Next, is it a curse that's turned Hawaii's newest highway into its deadliest?
They are waking up spirits that are even more powerful than the one before.
On a recent episode of Sightings, we brought you the story of the H3, a highway near Honolulu that's been plagued by unexplained accidents and tragic deaths. Many believe the road is cursed because it runs through a sacred Hawaiian burial ground, and recent accidents there seem to bear out the possibility that the curse of H3 is real.
The H3 is paved with tragedy. 2 dead, dozens injured. It's taken more than 20 years and $1.5 billion to build a highway that's only 16 miles long, making the H3 the most expensive stretch of road anywhere in the world. The H3 nightmare doesn't surprise many Hawaiians who believe that the H3 is cursed.
Their construction workers and subcontractors have witnessed equipment moving without operators being in them and then stopping and starting.
And according to one confidential source who has spoken with many H3 construction workers, a number of mysterious illnesses have befallen the work crew. Otherwise healthy young men have fainted, suffered cardiac arrest, and at least 2 have had heart attacks. Workers report, off the record, that the haunting activity and the illnesses are distracting them, causing them to make simple mistakes. Unofficially, it's the curse that's being blamed for this freak accident. On July 27, 1996, 4 60-ton girders cracked off the highway and plummeted to the valley below. 4 workers were hospitalized. Ironically, the accident occurred while workers were installing earthquake restraints to make the freeway safer. Lily Kala is an associate professor for Hawaiian studies at the University of Hawaii. She is an expert on Hawaiian history and mythology.
So this is the collapse, and they are trying to pretend like they don't know what's happening or they can't explain it, but gee, it must be something logical. They don't want to believe that it's Hawaiian gods.
But sources have told Sightings that some workers are starting to believe in the power and presence of these spirits.
Just before the highway section started to crack and collapsed, the workers reported hearing the sound of footsteps. They're spooked. They're really scared. The interesting thing is that because of the way the freeway span fell, those people should have been killed, and they survived. So we see this as a warning. This is not the end.
The contractors have attempted to appease critics by bringing in priests to bless the highway on a number of occasions. Native Hawaiians scoff at these overtures.
They think all they need is a Christian minister to come in and bless the site, and they can just continue, but that's not addressing the problem. Problem is desecration of sacred sites. You're dealing with different forces here. You're not dealing with something that Christianity can comprehend.
According to ancient Hawaiian teachings, the desecration of sacred sites invokes a curse called a heva, and the only way to remove the heva is to remove the highway.
It is not up to humans to try to bless or take away the heva by words. It is up to humans to take away the heva by deed. It will never be right for a freeway to be on top of those sacred places. Never. The heva will be there forever. And the strange things that we have seen happening there will continue to happen there.
And in fact, the H3 workers do appear to be the ones to bear the brunt of their ancestors' fury.
But they need to realize that as they go into that mountain, that they are waking up spirits and probably near certain burials or sacred places that are even more powerful than the one before. They need to realize that they should stop building this freeway.
The state of Hawaii plans to open the H3 in May of 1997 with a celebratory foot race for 60,000 runners. Historian Lily Kala believes this may turn out to be the ultimate indignity to her ancestors, and she fears for the future of the highway and its travelers.
If you've had a paranormal experience, please write to us at Sightings. Sightings can also be contacted at America Online at keyword Sightings. Download images, sounds, and QuickTime clips from Sightings episodes. On the internet, access information about sightings and the paranormal at sci-fi.com/sightings.
Until next time, remember, no mystery is closed to an open mind. For Sightings, I'm Tim White.
Experience strange and unexplained phenomena. Sightings is next on Sci-Fi.
Welcome to Sightings. I'm Tim White. Airline pilots see UFOs. They just don't talk about it. And their culture of silence explains a lot about why one series of reoccurring visits from enormous triangular craft has so far gone unreported. The UFOs, called silent Vulcans, are said to have made hundreds of appearances in the skies above Great Britain. But this is the first time the phenomenon is being discussed outside of England by professional pilots and others who have seen them.
Look at that! Bloody hell!
For the past 3 years, this is what hundreds of eyewitnesses have been watching and videotaping in the skies over England. These tapes are misleading because the UFOs are enormous, larger than any aircraft now flying. They are triangular in shape with large glowing lights at each corner. They can soar slowly, hover, or accelerate to a tremendous speed. But one of the most eerie aspects of these UFOs is what they don't do.
For sure, in all cases, people report that these things made no noise whatsoever. Some have been seen only a few hundred feet up.
From the left, this enormous craft came over the houses.
And I couldn't believe my eyes, because there was no sound at all from this object.
It banked over sharp to the left, and then I could see it was a huge triangle.
Investigators have dubbed them silent Vulcans for their passing resemblance to the British Delta Wing bomber known as the which recently investigated a near miss between a silent Vulcan and a British Airways 737 on approach to Manchester Airport. Commercial pilot Graham Shepherd, whose own airborne encounter has fueled a 20-year interest in UFOs, has studied the Manchester near miss.
Quite suddenly, what the crew described as a triangular, very brightly lit craft flew past them very, very close on their right-hand side. And the reports mentioned that the co-pilot instinctively ducked because it was so close. Now, they were clearly shaken up by this. They asked radar if they had any traffic, and radar didn't see anything.
The Civil Aviation Authority pursued their investigation of the case for more than a year and released their report in February of 1996. Their conclusion, however, was no conclusion at all. Only that the UFO was unknown. Case closed. When Graham Shepherd attempted to follow up with the...
On this edition of Sightings, a disturbing two-part report on enormous flying triangles that have recently been witnessed by thousands of people on the ground and in the air.
The co-pilot instinctively ducked because it was so close.
Then, Nick Pope from the British Ministry of Defense speaks out about the very real danger these UFOs represent to his government.
I certainly believe that some of them are extraterrestrial spacecraft.
New owners are renovating Arizona's historic Jerome Hotel, but some of its past just won't go away.
I couldn't prove that they are hauntings, and I couldn't prove that they're not.
Even if you've heard about biofeedback, its new uses will startle you. And is it an ancient curse that continues to plague the construction of Hawaii's newest highway?
It will never be right for a freeway to be on top of those sacred places. Never.
The Avro Vulcan B2. But that, according to UFO magazine editor Graham Birdsall, is where the similarity ends.
The Vulcan was a pretty much triangular-shaped aircraft, unique for its time. But certainly it was no bigger than, let's say, for instance, 60 feet across, and nothing like the kind of size that we associate with today's flying triangles, as it were.
Because they are so much larger than Vulcan B2s, some aircraft experts are suggesting that the UFOs may be part of a super-secret American stealth project.
I just cannot believe that something as big as that, flying over the United States fairly low, flying over here in the United Kingdom fairly low, and flying in such numbers, could be described as a conventional super-secret stealth aircraft. I just don't buy the argument.
Neither, apparently, does Britain's Civil Aviation Authority.